is my honor to introduce our presenter today, Laura Deal. Laura is a nationally known award-winning storyteller. She got her start telling stories to elementary school children in her Boulder neighborhood and went on to tell stories at festivals throughout the United States. She also participates in radio shows and podcasts dedicated to storytelling. I am a fledgling trained storyteller with the St. Vrain Valley Storytellers. As a result, I have had the privilege to hear Laura tell stories in large group professional settings and in small, intimate venues. Laura enchants her audience in any environment. You are in for a treat. Be prepared to be transported to other worlds. Laura's storytelling preserves our heritage, educates future generations, and inspires change. As someone once wrote, stories, as it turns out, are crucial to our evolution, more so than opposable thumbs. Opposable thumbs let us hang on. Stories tell us what to hang on to. So, let's hang on to every word that Laura tells us and let your imaginations soar.
Thank you very much for inviting me today, and thank you, Janet, for that lovely introduction and for the introduction to Rotary. I appreciate that. And I also want to thank Carl for your kind facilitation of organizing all of this. So, a show of hands. How many of you out there consider yourselves storytellers? And if I say, maybe not on stage, but among your family and friends when you're sitting around, how many of you have ever told a joke? Yeah, storytelling is really a universal experience. We come home and we tell our family about our day. All of that counts as storytelling. I got my start in storytelling from a background in writing. While my children were growing up, I was a stay-at-home mom, and I had a writing practice of a minimum of a page a day. And I played the New York publishing game, and I got very, very close a few times, but never quite cracked the code. And so in 2016, when my youngest left for college and I was facing my empty nest, I knew I needed something that would fill my time and fill that creative impulse. And so I started looking into storytelling, and I quickly found Spellbinders. There's the logo up in the corner there. And Spellbinders is an organization that trains primarily elders in the traditional art of oral storytelling and how to find a story and how to put together a program, and then places us in the elementary schools in a specific classroom where we go in once a month and do a 20 to 30 minute program for the children. And the original purpose of Spellbinders was to build that intergenerational bridge, to help seniors who might be isolated and children who might not have adults or a grandparent figure in their life. And so that was really the whole purpose behind it. And it turns out storytelling is really good for kids' brains. They learn how to be a good listener. They learn sequencing, because a lot of stories have several steps to them that repeat. And all of that contributes to their literacy. But the kids don't know that. They just get excited because the storyteller's here, and they just get to sit back and enjoy the stories. So it's been the heart and soul of my storytelling journey. As Janet mentioned, I also did pursue some professional opportunities, but I always come back to Spellbinders and the kids as what really grounds me, because let me tell you, kindergarten kids will keep you honest. So I was asked to talk about the art and creativity of storytelling, and for me, the creativity part of it, really, the art comes down to creativity and craft, I believe. And the creativity part, this was the image that I always had in my head when I was writing my page a day. And I would focus and I would sit down, and I often only had as long as Sesame Street was on to write my page. And so it took some real focus. And it always felt to me like it was sort of coming in from outside and coming down through my mind and out my fingers. And that practice of opening to that creativity still serves me when I'm working on a story. And I also found that consulting with other storytellers is very helpful. I find that we have a synergy that happens when we talk with other people, as I'm sure you've experienced in your work and your lives when you brainstorm something with someone else. I recently did this with a story I was working on, which in the storytelling world is called a lie. And a lie is a story that starts based in truth. In this particular case, it was a story about when my husband exploded a spaghetti squash in the microwave oven, which in and of itself became a family legend. But then when you build a lie, you start there, but you get more and more and more ridiculous and absurd until it becomes clear that you have left the bounds of reality. And for this particular lie, I consulted a wonderful storyteller named Paul Strickland, who is probably the funniest man that I have ever met. He got his start in stand-up comedy and became a storyteller. And that inspiration that happens when he has an idea and that lightning strikes in my mind, that is worth gold. So I want to share a story with you about the craft. This is a story that I was told was a Chinese folktale, but the more that I research it, the less certain I am that somebody didn't just make it up. But it's a wonderful tale. It's about a rich man who admired very much the work of an artist in his town, and he wanted a painting by that artist. And so he approached her and he asked if she would paint for him a painting of a fish. And she agreed, but she said, give me a few months. And so he waited, and then he saw her in the marketplace, and he said, have you got my painting of the fish? And she said, give me a few more months. And he waited, and finally a year had gone by. And he went to her studio and asked for permission to come in, and she invited him in, and he said, where is my painting? And she brought out a blank sheet of paper and brush and ink, and in a few simple gestures, she created the most elegant painting of a fish. And he was outraged. I have waited a year for this painting, and it took you a matter of moments? I should just tear it up. This is so disrespectful. And she said, please, come with me. Let me show you something. And she took him to the back of the studio, and she opened a door, And there in the room were piles and piles and piles of parchment covered in studies of fish. Some leaping, some swimming, some absolutely beautiful, much more beautiful than others, but none as exquisite as the one that she had just painted for him. And then he understood. And he took his fish painting home and displayed it proudly on his wall. So for me, there's not a room full of parchment paper. There's a voice recorder full of rehearsals and recordings that I have done, because when I'm learning a story, I will listen to it over and over, and I will say it aloud over and over. So it's that repetition that comes with any art form in any craft. But in addition to that, there is the learning from other storytellers. So I first got interested in storytelling really when I went to the Conference on World Affairs and heard Liz Weir and Claire Murphy, two brilliant Irish storytellers. And I would sit in the audience and think, I should be doing that. And so when I started getting involved in it, in addition to finding Spellbinders, I found this group called the Boulder Story Circle, which at that time was run by Cooper Brown and Rachel Ann Harding. Cooper on the left in that group photo, Rachel Ann on the far right. And that was a place where we could go and we could share stories and practice stories. And they were a few years ahead of me on the professional track, even though they're a generation younger. And they very generously told me about all the different opportunities that I could try for, different conferences to go to, different festivals to attend. And it was at one of those conferences that I met Katie Knudsen, who's the other woman in that photo. And this photo is actually from a house concert we just did last weekend. Katie's from Minnesota, but was in town in the state to do the High Plains Chautauqua up in Greeley, and so we put together a house concert. And the other group that's been absolutely essential to my development as a storyteller is Artists Standing Strong Together, which is abbreviated ASST, which is pronounced assist, because this group got started on March 16th, 2020, when everything was shutting down, and two professional storytellers were together at the Women's Festival in Fairfax, Virginia, and they sat and spoke to each other and said, you know, it's clear all the storytellers are going to lose all their gigs, because there was none of this happening then. And so they decided to have a Zoom call where they invited all the storytellers to come and talk about what will we need. And they set up a storytelling relief fund, which is still in use today for storytellers who maybe needed to pay a utility bill that they otherwise couldn't afford. And they started doing online storytelling programming, which is still going on today. And they decided to keep having these meetings on Mondays. And we have met every Monday except for Labor Day and Memorial Day since March 16th, 2020. This last week we celebrated number 222. This is a meeting that regularly gets 30 to 40 people to come. And in the early days, we learned about how to tell stories online and how to set up your background so that you looked professional and all of that. So they really helped me with how to do that online and how to connect with people. And through them, I have expanded my community greatly. The other thing they do is an online storytelling camp for children, where they put together an experienced storyteller with a child, and then they put 4 of those pairs in a class together. And we have had students from 6 continents, and I personally was able to mentor 2 sisters from Uganda as part of that program. Oh, there we go. So, as wonderful as it is to be able to tell stories online, there is nothing like telling stories in person. And I forgot to mention in that first slide, that picture was of the first time that I got to go back into the classroom after doing remote storytelling for the entire 2020-21 school year. And when I walked into the classroom on that May day, the kids looked up at me and said, "Oh, you're real?" Because they had only ever seen me on the screen. And there is something magical that happens, at least it feels magical. Science has now proven it with MRI scans, that when the storyteller tells a story and the audience listens to that story, we experience something that they call neural mirroring, which means the same parts of my brain light up as the parts of your brain when you're hearing that story. And so there's a collective imagining of that story as we go through the story. And that imagining, I believe, is one of the basic building blocks of compassion. Because when I tell the story of the fish painting, you can imagine yourself as that artist who knows how much work she's put into it and being misjudged. You can imagine yourself as the rich man who thinks he's being cheated. And being able to imagine the lives of other people makes it possible that when we meet someone new on the street, maybe we don't jump to the first conclusion, but we get curious about what their stories are. And so coming back to the kids in person, in the classroom, that gave me so much hope during that difficult time of the pandemic. And it's such a treat. There is a relationship that gets built. Probably the biggest compliment that I ever received was at the end of the school year, a couple years ago. A kindergarten boy came up to me, and usually they'll say, "You're the best storyteller." And I know there's some other Spellbinders in the room that have heard that as well. And this boy came up to me and said, "I hope you're the one that rents my mom's basement." Can you imagine a better compliment than that? So I want to close with a story that is really one of my absolute favorite stories. I learned this from a Swiss storyteller named Isabel Hauser, who got it from a book that was put together by an Austrian storyteller named Frau Wolle. And Frau Wolle generously gave me permission to add this to my repertoire and record it for my new CD. And it has become really one of my absolute favorites. Once there was a queen, and she ruled her realm with a wise head, a firm hand, and a warm heart. And she would often ride out among her people to see how they were doing. And one day she came to a crossroads, and at this crossroads there was an old woman, bent back, gnarled hands, and she had a shovel and a bucket of water and some sticks, one of which was stuck into the ground. And the queen greeted her. The woman bowed. The queen said, "Tell me, what is it you're doing?" She said, "Oh, I am planting trees. I am planting apple and linden and oak." And the queen looked at this old woman and said, "Forgive me for saying so, but those are very slow-growing trees. You will never drink the cider from that apple tree, nor attend a wedding under that linden tree, nor hold a council under that oak tree. Why don't you plant something that grows more quickly?" The old woman said, "Yes, you're right, you're right. But in my day, I have enjoyed much apple cider, and I have been to many weddings under a linden tree, and I have been to far too many councils under oak trees. I am planting these trees for those who come after." And the queen liked that answer, and she gave the old woman a gold coin. "Oh, my queen, do you see how fortunate I am? Most trees take years to bear fruit, and mine has already given me a harvest." And like you, the queen laughed. And because she had so little to laugh about, she gave the old woman a second gold coin. "Oh, my queen, 2 harvests in one day. Most trees take years. Every year you get one. Oh, this is wonderful." And the queen said, "Tell me, how old are you?" The woman straightened up a little bit. "I am 6 years old." "6? How do you figure?" "Well, forgive me for saying so, but the one who ruled before you, he was not a good king. He led us into war, and I lost my husband and my son to that war, and people didn't have enough to eat. That was no life. But since you became our queen 6 years ago, we have had peace and prosperity, and so I count my life as beginning when you became our queen." And as you can imagine, that answer also pleased the queen. And she gave the old woman a 3rd gold coin, and then she said, "My dear old woman, my dear young old woman, I'm afraid I shall have to ride on, or you will end up with all the coins in my treasury." And she bid her a good day, and the old woman waved as the queen rode away, and then she picked up her bucket of water, and she watered her trees. And so I would encourage you to tell your stories and build bridges to the next generation. Share your stories with the younger people in your life, with your family and friends and neighbors, because every story allows us to practice that imagination, and every story helps build compassion. And honestly, I can't think of anything that the world needs more of right now. So with that, I want to say thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Fantastic.
All right.
Well, thanks for speaking to our club. Much appreciated. I just wanted to bring out that the anthropologist, Stephen Minthan, studied caves in France and hypothesizes that there were stories before there were language, and they were told by pantomime. And he wanted to relabel us from Homo sapiens to Homo fictus, the storytelling man. So gives you an idea of what stories are. My question concerns the music of language and how stories are told. And I don't know if you watched the film Ferris Bueller's Day Off, but Ben Stein, the well-known conservative economist, is in there's a teacher and he bores the students to death because he has no prosody in the way his deliverance. It's all monotone. So what role does the music of language have? Not just the words, but how they're stressed and the tone and the rhythm.
What a great question. That could be another 20-minute talk right there. I think that anyone who has told stories, especially in a professional capacity or as a volunteer with Spellbinders, you find that certain patterns of speech tend to help the children roll along with the story. Rhythm and rhyme are essential. There's repetition that helps with children holding on to a story. There are many, many stories where you have the good daughter goes off and has something that brings great fortune after a number of steps, and then the second daughter, who's usually the mean one, goes and has those same steps. So that kind of repetition helps. But certainly if there's rhyme within that, that helps the brain hang on to it. I did a workshop recently at the Story Crossroads Festival out in Utah, and we talked about how using rhyme and things like that can help with memory recall when you're telling a story, because you know what comes next. And there are many storytellers that also use music in their stories. I'm working on a piece right now that will, it's a longer form piece, and it will include stories about my dad interspersed with the song Clementine, because that was a song that he often sang to me when I was little. So yeah, I think it's crucial. The children love poetry too, and you can do stories through poetry as well. Yeah.
Well, you're talking to a club full of storytellers, I think.
Gathered.
But some we repeat, others, well, we keep to ourselves. But I'm interested, with all the work you do with children, to what extent are we fulfilling the natural desire of children to tell stories? When I lived overseas with my wife and family several times, we'd have a story time at night in which the kids told us the story of their day. Mm-hmm. And of course that added vocabulary. As we'd add that, we asked them to do it in the language we were living in. But children just love to tell stories. And I wonder how we're developing that skill through the work that you're doing.
Well, I have done some of that through Spellbinders. I did last January, February. I worked with 7th and 8th graders at Horizons, is that the charter school? And worked with them to develop their own stories. Generally with the youngsters, it's like when I listen to a story, it's sort of passive practice. And so they're getting that sense of what makes a story without specific instruction. That being said, if I say this is a story from Japan, hands will go up. My mom went to Japan and they've all got that. They want to jump in and they want to share their stories. Another favorite moment of mine was when I was telling a story from Puerto Rico, and this little girl raised her hand. She said, "I've been to Puerto Rico." And that's wonderful. And then her face kind of fell as I was telling this story, which is a very funny story. And she came up to me. That was the first story in the program, so there were 2 more. And after the end of the last story, she came up to me and she said, I remembered I haven't been to Puerto Rico. I've been to Puerto Vallarta. So they definitely are making connections all along the way. And I do know that some of the students would go home and tell their family the stories that I had told them that day. I got feedback from the teachers about that. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for speaking today. I really enjoyed that, and I think oftentimes it's the best way to convey a message is in the form of a metaphor, which is often a story. I'm curious what your thoughts are on sort of pop culture and sort of what we see in the movie theaters today most commonly, and what becomes popular on Netflix and other streaming platforms. And if you think the stories are more negative, they're more positive, or what are your thoughts on how things tend to go in pop culture?
Well, I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that question because I do not consume a lot of pop culture. But what I have seen, I think we're discovering more and more ways to tell a story. Movies have always relied on that ability to tell a story, except for some of the really out there experimental things. I do think that there's, one of the reasons I don't take in a lot of pop culture is because a lot of it does feel negative or excessively violent to me, and I have such an active, vivid imagination that if I see a movie like that, it stays with me for a long time, and it's hard to get it out of my brain again. So I would be all for, when we do watch a movie and we don't have any kids in the house anymore, we often pick a children's movie because we know that it's not going to have all of those really dark elements. So I would love to see more lighthearted, gentle films.
Again, thank you for speaking with us today. When you spoke, you talked about sort of two, at least in my mind, different things. One is kind of the performance side, where the story is being told, oftentimes a story that was originally written by someone else, or at least thought. And then there's the creative side of creating your stories. A little bit about that second element, how you create stories from scratch that you present.
Well, it goes back to that that sense of opening to inspiration. Sometimes, when I had my page-a-day practice, there were days where it felt like every word was just like, and then other days where it just totally flowed, and when I would go back and read what I had written, I couldn't tell the difference. So I've learned to sort of allow that to happen. The spaghetti squash story, I ended up sitting with my husband and my 26-year-old daughter over dinner, and they just kept popping up with funny possibilities. And so then it's a matter of knowing story structure. Where do I want to start? How do I want to build that arc of what's going to happen in the story? Think about what are the stakes in the story. Why would anyone care about this? A lot of stories we try to start with some kind of common element. So with the spaghetti squash story, if you've ever tried to cut one in half, you know how hard that is. That's the premise behind the story, is to find a way to do that. So for me, it's about taking those ideas and just allowing them to grow. I'll often sit with the story for days or weeks, sometimes months or years. This piece I'm working on about my dad has been evolving. He passed 5 years ago, and it's been evolving and sort of gestating up there ever since. And then at some point, I know that feeling of I don't really know how to pull it all together, the answer to that is just to sit down and write it. Because if I do that, then it becomes more clear. Sometimes I think of it like pottery, throwing mud on the wheel. You can't build a pot unless you have some mud on the wheel, and you can't craft a story unless you've got that first draft and the ideas sort of in place. And then you can start to shape it and make it into something. One of the stories I tell started out as a picture book manuscript that I shopped around for many years, also got very close on, and it's called The Diff and Daffer Taffy Cafe. It's full of alliteration and all of that. And when I got into storytelling, I thought, I wonder if I could tell that. And so some of it is that, going back to things I used to do, and some of it's just taking inspiration from what's happening in my life.
I'm just curious, in the storytelling that you do with the kids, you know, you think of things like Aesop's fables, that there's a moral to the story, and there's kind of, you can interpret it, but there's a point, right? And then there's things that end, you know, going the other direction, like the last episode of The Sopranos, where it's left open to interpretation, and you don't know what's happened. I'm curious to what extent you discuss the stories after you tell them with the kids, and whether you're leaving things up to interpretation for the kids, or whether there's a moral or something that you're trying to teach through the stories.
That's a great question. There is often, I mean, I choose my stories, especially with the kindergartners. I've told other grades as well. But I try to choose stories that either support the curriculum. So when I first started, the teacher I was working with was like, we're going to be talking about trees. So I brought in stories about trees. But stories that support kindness and all of that, the kind of community qualities that the school is trying to impart to the kids. We don't generally do, in Spellbinders, we don't generally do okay, now I've told my story, what do you think? But occasionally somebody will raise their hand and ask for some point of clarification. You know, why did they do that? And then we'll talk about what happened in that story. I leave that up to the teachers if they want to go into it more after I've left. But the idea of me standing up there and saying this is what the story means takes away from the individual child being able to take that story in, because what resonates for them might be totally different than what resonates for me or for the child sitting next to them. They might have a very different home experience, and they might be thinking about who's going to rent my mom's basement when they're, you know, trying to focus on the story. So a lot of it is left to them. With the kindergartners, I do start with simpler stories at the beginning of the year, because they're learning how to do, you know, listening and all of that. By the end of, well, even by the middle of the year, I can tell them a 10 to 15 minute story, and they will track and hang on to it all. And I know these stories stay with them, because I was doing the kindergarten for several years at Mesa Elementary, and then I finally got into the first and second grade. And these second graders had heard my stories when they were in kindergarten, but they had not heard me tell when they were in first grade. And that very first day when I sat down, I said, what stories do you remember that I told you in kindergarten? Hands went up. You know, they couldn't do the whole story, but they could be like, the one about the rainbow crow, or the one about the... And together, as a group, they came up with, I think, 10 different stories. And the teacher was gobsmacked, you know. She couldn't believe it, because there's something so essential about story and music and painting and all of that that gets into the psyche of the child, and they really hang on to it. And so what they take away from that story can change as they grow and think back on it.
Do we have any more questions? All right, one more.
These are great questions, by the way.
And I think this is going to be our last question.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. And the pressure of this having to be a good question is certainly hitting me. One comment. You know, when I was working with the division of IBM, and we went through sales training, they said, when you're talking to a customer, make a story up. Don't just tell the facts. Make it a story, which worked very well. So one of my problems in telling my grandchildren a story is I'm trying to make it humorous. And then often halfway through I realize they just won't get this. So, you have any thoughts on how to tell a story to make sure they get the references?
Yeah, that is a good question.
Thank you.
There are stories, I think, that it is hard to bring in things that they've never experienced. So making it humorous is one way, but explaining as you go is all right too. I have a story that's, I mean, I'm sure Dave and Alan have heard a version of this story that's told all over the world, and it's about the tailor who makes a coat, and when it wears out, he makes a jacket, and when it wears out, he makes a vest. And the way I tell that story is I set it in the Depression. And I say, this is a story that my father heard when he was just your age. And I have to explain a little bit about what the Depression was, but I don't have to say much more than it was a really hard time. Most people didn't have very much money, and so they had to make do with what they had. And then I add in this rhyme that I learned as a kid that was something my grandmother taught my father, which is use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. And so that becomes a refrain that they can say with me as we go along. So I think it's totally fine to tell them a story, and if they're not getting it, you can pause and say, do you have any questions about what I'm talking about? Another example, and I'll close with this, was from another chapter of Spellbinders. There was a fellow who told a story about Prunes, the donkey, which is a Colorado true story. It was a mining donkey, but he called him a burro throughout the story. He tells this story, I think it was to 3rd or 4th grade, and at the very end of this story, this kid raises his hand and says, "What's a burro?" So clearly, sometimes it just goes right overhead. But we do try to explain as we go along if there's vocabulary they might not know. So thank you again. It was really a delight to be with you today.
So Laura, we have a tradition at Rotary, which is that Rotary gets the last word. It seems singularly inappropriate to do that today because we're so inspired by not only the stories, but the importance of storytelling and the science and the magic behind it. So we really want to thank you for exposing us to that, and I hope creating an opportunity for creativity and storytelling in our own lives. Rotary does have a story to tell, and that is that we work together with Rotaries throughout the world trying to eradicate polio. And in your honor, we will donate 100 doses of polio vaccine for this important work. Thank you very much for a really wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much for that. I had a very dear relative who had polio and farmed in Nebraska on crutches his entire adult life and suffered post-polio syndrome when he got older. So that touches my heart deeply. Thank you very much.